this video, we're going to be talking about the legislative and administrative process. So let's begin with the legislative process. And specifically, we are going to be focusing on the federal legislative and administrative processes. However, each state will have a similar process for creating both statutory law and regulatory law. So, for the legislative process at the federal level, we need to understand the structure of the U.S. Congress. So, Congress has two branches known as houses. So, you have the Senate and the House of Representatives. And finally, we have the president, who, although he is not part of the legislative branch, he does play a role in the legislative process. So the legislative process starts with the filing of a bill. And that bill can be filed either by a senator, in which case it will begin its legislative process in the United States Senate. Or the bill can also be filed by a representative, in which case it will begin its legislative journey in the House of Representatives. Now, if a bill is proposed by a senator, the entire Senate will vote on the bill, and if a majority of the senators pass the bill, then the bill passes the Senate, and then it will go on to the House of Representatives for the House of Representatives consideration. Similarly, if the bill is proposed by a representative, the bill will be considered by the House of Representatives, and if it is passed by a majority of the representatives, then it passes the House and goes on to the Senate. Once a bill is passed through both houses of Congress, it will go to the president regardless of where its journey began. So a bill can be proposed by a senator, passed by the Senate, passed by the House of Representatives, and then go to the president, or the bill can be proposed by a representative, pass the House of Representatives, then pass the Senate, and then it will still go to the president. Once the president has the bill, the president can either sign the bill, in which case it becomes law, or the president can veto the bill, in which case it does not become law. There is also a process for the United States Congress to override a presidential veto, and how that works is that once it gets to the president's desk, he decides to veto it and sends it back to Congress, and then Congress has the option to attempt to override the veto, and in order to override the veto, both houses need to uh, vote by a 2/3 majority to override the veto. So now we need to talk about the post-legislative process. So once we get a law, that law will either be given a public law number, or it will be given a private law number. Now, you don't really need to worry too much about private laws. Private laws are acts of Congress that extend special privileges to a person. And so this is typically used to grant individuals citizenship outside of the ordinary naturalization process, and it is also used to grant military awards outside of the usual military award process. Now, once the law is given a public or private law number, the law is then published in what is known as the U.S. Statutes at Large. And the U.S. Statutes at Large is essentially just a ledger of every act that Congress has ever passed. And in this form, the law is known as a session law. Now, you can go read the U.S. Statutes at Large, but it is very difficult to do legal research with it because the laws are organized sequentially from the date that they were passed rather than by subject matter. The Statutes at Large is also not edited, so when Congress votes to repeal an old law, they will just publish an act that states that they are repealing the old law in the statutes at large, but no one actually goes back and edits out the old law that got repealed. So you can still find the repealed law in the statutes at large. So to make law easier to research, Congress pays lawyers to go organize the statutes at large into something known as the U.S. Code. And the U.S. Code is organized by subject matter, and it is edited to remove repealed laws. So the takeaway from this process is that statutory law has two forms. There's the session law, which is found in the statutes at large. And this is sort of the raw data that is not organized and that is not easy to research. And then you have the code section, which is found in the U.S. Code. And the U.S. Code, like we talked about, is organized by subject matter and edited to remove repealed laws. Now, in the unlikely event that there is ever a conflict between a session law and the corresponding code section, the session law will control. But the idea is that the U.S. Code is not supposed to be in conflict with the statutes at large. The U.S. Code is simply a reflection of the statutes that are actually in effect and organized by subject matter. It is also worth noting that nowadays most acts of Congress are uh, written in such a way as to amend sections of the U.S. Code, so it can be quite confusing if you try to read a statute that Congress enacts before it's been edited into the U.S. Code, because a single section of a session law may amend multiple sections of the U.S. Code, and there is not necessarily a one-to-one correspondence between the sections of a session law and the sections of the U.S. Code. So that covers the legislative process, so now let's talk about the administrative process. And what we will find is that the administrative process is actually quite similar to the legislative process. So at the federal level, the administrative process is largely governed by something known as the Administrative Procedures Act. And basically, how the administrative process works is that an agency that is part of the executive branch will propose a new regulation, and then that regulation will go through the rule making process. And the rulemaking process may look a little bit different depending on the agency, but in general, the rulemaking process requires a period of public comment in which interested members of the public can submit comments to the agency, either persuading them to adopt the rule or to reject the rule. Once this public comment period is completed, then the agency can decide whether or not to make its proposed rule a final rule. And if it chooses to make the rule a final rule, then it will be published in something known as the Federal Register. And the Federal Register actually contains a lot of materials besides simply final rules. It will also contain the proposed rule so that the public has notice that an agency is proposing a new rule. And in certain industries, businesses will actually pay lawyers to just read the Federal Register and update the businesses anytime that a rule that may affect that industry is proposed. But much like the U.S. statutes at large, the Federal Register is mostly published sequentially and is not organized by subject matter, and so it is not easy to research. And so, after the agencies publish their final rules in the Federal Register, they will then codify the rule into the Code of Federal Regulations. So you can see that both the legislative and administrative process follow the same general pattern, especially in the post-legislation phase. So you have statutory law and regulatory law. And each of these have two different forms. So statutory law has sort of the raw data form of session laws, which are published in the statutes at large, which again is just a ledger of all of the acts of Congress. And each state will have something similar to the statutes at large. So, for instance, Washington State calls its session laws chapters of law, but the point is that each state has something similar. And then agencies, when they enact regulatory law, also have their own raw version of the regulatory law, which are called final rules that are published in the Federal Register. And each state also has its own state register that publishes the raw data of the regulatory laws in the state. And once the session laws are enacted, they are edited and organized into code sections, which appear in the US Code, and regulations have a similar editing process where they are edited and organized into code sections of the Code of Federal Regulations.